Please ensure you have selected the correct language that you will listen in, either English or French. To select the appropriate language, please locate and click on the globe icon on the bottom taskbar of this window, or more if you are on a mobile device, and select either English or French. Please also remember that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions of the presenters throughout this session. I would now like to introduce Elaine Feldman, Senior Fellow at the University of Ottawa and Board Member at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, who will be the moderator for this session. Elaine?
Thank you very much, Martha. And for those of you who can see me, I am lying on my couch with my knee out because I have a recent total knee replacement. So I'm very pleased to be here. I think this is an extremely important panel that will be looking at the impacts of country-specific climate change policies on agricultural production, trade, global food security, and competitiveness. It's particularly timely given that we have the Biden administration's renewed commitment to the Paris Action Plan, we have Canada's climate plan, and we have the EU's Green New Deal. And to set the stage for the discussion, we have a recent paper from the US Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service that looks at various scenarios in light of the EU Action Green Deal. So I'm going to turn the session over now to the two authors of that recent study, Jason Beckman. You've got their bios online. Jason is a senior economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, and Maros Ivanic, who is an agricultural economist, also with the USDA's Economic Research Service. And I'm told that the two have known each other since they first met at Purdue University. So with that very brief introduction, let me turn it over to Jason.
Great. So thanks very much for having us. So we will basically be doing a two-part session. I'll be talking about this report that we published back in November, and then Maros will be talking about some work that we've done since then. So next slide, please. So the EU Green Deal is basically what they state is their plan to make the EU's economy sustainable. Now underneath the Green Deal, there are many different what they call strategies that dwell with different parts of the economy, in particular related to the environment. The ones that we are interested in for our work is the farm to fork and a little bit dealing with the biodiversity strategies. But these strategies that you are still ongoing, they recently released one on deforestation. So this is still a fluid idea. So within the farm to fork strategies, they talk about the need to promote sustainability, and there are 4 areas of improvement that they note, which you could read here. So our work focuses on that first one, sustainable food production. In particular, we're going to look at how does changing agricultural inputs affect food production and food security. Next slide, please. So underneath this farm to fork and biodiversity strategies, the European Union, technically the European Commission, they state that they want to look at many different aspects related to sustainability. Some of these are a little bit more straightforward to understand and to put into an economic framework. Those are listed here on the left, and they're what we consider in our work. And they're input reductions. And you can see that they would like to reduce pesticide use by 50%, fertilizer use by 20%, land by 10%, and antimicrobial use by 50%. So these are the what we're going to consider in our paper. And we're going to look at 3 scenarios. The first is what happens if the EU is the only region that implements these input reductions. A middle scenario where I'll describe a little bit more detail next, but basically some countries also join the EU in implementing these input reductions. And the third one says what happens if everyone in the world implements these input reductions. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are many different aspects of sustainability within the farm to fork study. So our analysis excludes several of these, many of which they're more difficult to understand exactly what the EU wants to do, or they're more difficult to put into an economic framework. And they include labeling and animal welfare. One interesting one is a pesticide risk. So with that pesticide reduction that I mentioned before, the EU actually states they want a 50% reduction in pesticide use and risk, but they don't really say what that risk is. Are they going to ban certain pesticides, and what pesticides are they going to ban? So we just exclude anything related to the risk aspect. In addition, they want to increase organic production. We know how much they want to increase it by, but we don't know what crops this is going to apply to. So rather than try to make some best guesses, we just exclude any of these factors here. In addition, our work doesn't consider environmental impacts. These could imply potential costs such as compliance, or benefits such as more honeybees. In addition, we don't consider any productivity changes, but Marlos will go into that in more detail next. Next slide, please. So back to that middle scenario, a little bit more information. So the EU tends to put barriers in place on products produced with different technologies than what they use in the European Union. Some examples are the maximum residue limits. In addition, for the US, exports of US beef, chicken, and pork, as they are produced in the US, are banned in the EU. So, for example, the chicken produced with the chlorine wash is completely banned. So basically, we took the idea that given that these bans tend to be in place with different technologies, we're going to say that the EU is going to prohibit some trade from countries that do not adopt the strategies. And we're not going to completely shut off trade. What we do is assume that there's going to be a 50% reduction in agricultural trade between those who adopt the input reductions and those who do not. So this could be, the 50% could allow for, say, farmers who still want to export to the EU. They could adopt the input reductions, or different products that may be produced without those technologies. So for this work, we assume certain countries adopt these input reductions along with the EU. And they are basically countries that depend on the EU as a source as a destination for their agricultural exports. And they include Sub-Saharan Africa, the European Free Trade Association countries, other European countries who aspire to join the European Union, and the Middle East and Northern Africa. Next slide, please. So for this work, we're going to use a global economic model known as GTAP. GTAP is used throughout the world. This map here just shows the board members. So you could see that the Government of Canada, many agencies within the US, such as USDA, USITC, EPA, are all board members. Many organizations, World Bank, IFPRI, the European Commission is a board member. So basically, a lot of the big economic organizations are on our consortium members and help dictate the data and modeling for the model that we use. Next slide, please. So the model is known as a computable general equilibrium model, which basically means that we have data on and equations linking all activities in the economy, so agriculture, non-agriculture, and all countries in the world. And I'll walk you through a little bit about how it works. So you can see here in the bottom left, to produce a crop, you can imagine corn, you need land, labor, capital in the form of tractors and buildings, and pesticides and fertilizers. So you produce a crop in the model. This crop is then used for many different purposes. So for corn, it could be used for biofuels. Other crops could be used for human consumption or for clothing. To simplify it, I just show the linkage going to feed. So in order to produce feed, you need crops, labor, and capital. And then this feed is then used to produce meat. So we have all these linkages going on with different parts of the economy. And going on with all of this is other countries in the world. So the example here is just US and other countries. But the United States and everyone else is also producing crops, feed, and meat at the same time. And so they can all trade with each other. So basically what we're gonna look at is we're gonna think about what happens if you remove some of these inputs into the crop production. Next slide. So if you remove some of the land, pesticides and fertilizers used to produce crops, then basically one of three things could happen. One, you could have a decrease in production. So farmers could say, well, we don't have the necessary inputs, so we can't produce as much corn and everything else. So as you saw in that last slide, that if you have an impact on crops, it's going to affect feed, it's going to affect meats. In addition, farmers could say, well, in order to keep crop production stable, we're going to use more labor and capital. So maybe we have more people out in the fields pulling weeds, or maybe more passes in the tractor. So that could happen, but there's a finite amount of labor and capital for a country. So if you take labor and capital and put it on the farm, it's going to have to come from somewhere. So maybe automobile manufacturers, people stop working there. So the point is if you take labor from one place and move it to another, you're going to affect that initial place. And the third thing that could happen is an increase in imports. So the European Union could just decide to buy crops, feed, and meat on the international market. The problem with that is that the European Union is a major agricultural producer and trader. So if you take away some of the European Union product on the market, and they're now importing a lot of products, it's going to have an impact on global prices, right? Because there's a finite amount of product that is traded. And basically what we'll see is that all three of these things occur in our model. Next slide, please. So here are the results. What our model estimates for that first scenario, where the European Union is the only region that adopts these strategies. So you can basically see that we have that decrease in production that we predicted. Model estimates a decrease of 12%, and prices go up because there's less product available on the domestic market, increasing competition. Exports decrease since there's less product available. Farm income decreases. That's basically the confluence of production and prices. So the decrease in production does not make up for that increase in prices. And the model estimates that farmers have a decrease in farm income. We also estimate the impact on food costs. So this is per person per year. So the model estimates an increase in food costs from the EU adopting the strategies in the EU of $153 a person, and a decrease in GDP of 71 billion. Now for the US and for all other countries in the world, there's a slight increase in production as they try to fill the lost EU production. Prices increase by 5%, and this is mainly because they're exporting more to the EU. So there's more competition within the US, increasing prices. You can see that food cost increase by about a third of what they do in the EU, and there's a $2 billion decrease in GDP. So the model estimates that all these other countries are not able to make up for the loss in EU ag production, and there's a 1% decrease in the world, and prices increase, trade falls. This time we have, you can see here, this food insecurity. So along with what we got going on here, we also estimate the impact in food security for the 76 poorest countries in the world. And the results indicate that there'd be an increase of those people of 22 million. And then for the global GDP, model estimates a $94 billion decrease, of which you can see most of that is from the EU. Next slide, please. So now for that middle scenario, basically what happens in our model is the world becomes two trading blocks. So you have the EU and everyone else who are adopting the strategies. You have the US, Brazil, Canada, who do not adopt the strategies, and they basically just trade within each other. So our model estimates a bigger impacts to the EU. So same story, production falls, prices go up, trade decreases by 10%, and food costs are now estimated at $651 a person per year in the EU. And you can see a larger decrease in GDP of $186 billion. So for the US and for those countries who do not adopt the strategies, the impacts are smaller. There's basically little impact to production and prices. There's a slight decrease in US exports, and a very small increase in food costs and a small decrease in GDP. So for the world, this time the impacts are bigger than what they were if only the EU adopts the strategies. And basically you can see that global trade would decrease by 9% as, like I said, US, Brazil, Canada trade with each other, and the European Union trades mostly with the African and other European partners. Global GDP is estimated to decrease by $381 billion. Almost half of that is the EU, but a lot of it is those other partners who are adopting the strategies. Next slide, please. So the final scenario basically says, what if everyone in the world adopts these strategies? You can basically see similar impacts across the US, EU, and the world because everyone has these input reductions. So again, decreases in production, price increases more than 50% for the EU, US, and the world. The model estimates some big increases in food costs per person, $600 a person in the EU, $500 a person in the US, and $450 in the world. And I will get into it a little bit more about this change to food insecurity, but the model estimates 185 more food insecure people in the 76 poorest countries in the world if everyone were to adopt these input reductions. And you can see a global decrease in GDP of a little bit more than $1 trillion a year. Next slide, please. So we can briefly look at the impacts to individual ag commodities. So you can see the red bar shows what happens if the EU is the only region who adopts the strategies. So there's decreases in all ag output, but they tend to be between 1% and 2%. And you can see as more countries adopt the strategies, you have larger decreases in production, accumulating with a more than 20% decrease in the production of sugar crops if everyone in the world were to adopt the strategies. Next slide. And a similar pattern happens for prices. So you can see for the EU only, prices increase by about 5%. In that middle scenario, you're getting close to 100% for some crops. With everyone in the world adopting these strategies, you're hitting almost a 300% increase in the prices for some commodities. And you can basically see sort of the linkages that I was showing before with the CGE model. The largest impacts are to crops because they are the ones being directly impacted by the reduction in fertilizer pesticides. And then you see smaller increases in the products that tend to use those crops. But still, you get increases of almost 100% for some processed commodities. Next slide. So finally, the food insecurity headcount. So a similar pattern. The EU is the only region that adopts the strategies. The model estimated a 22 million increase in food insecure people, 22 million. These are mainly in other Asia and Africa. In that middle scenario, there's an increase in food insecurity of more than 100 million people. But this time, since we're assuming that Africa joins with the EU, all of that increase is basically manifested in the Africa region. So you see very little increase in other Asia this time because they are not adopting the strategies. And finally, the largest change is to that global scenario. And you can see that other Asia and India at this time and Africa have a large increase in the number of food insecure people. Next slide. So basically, to summarize our results, production declines, and because of that, food prices increase. Because of the decline in production, ag trade falls, food insecurity increases, and the economy shrinks. Next slide. So, are these results feasible? So to look at why these things happen, you can go back to basic Econ 101, and you can see that we have prices here on the vertical axis. We have quantity going from left to right. Econ theory says that demand is downward sloping. So as prices decrease, consumers want more. Supply is upward sloping. So as prices are higher, producers want to supply more. And where they meet in the middle, that P0, Q0 is our initial equilibrium. So there are many things that could affect the demand and supply curves. So you can have an increase in population, which pushes out the demand curve and increases how much you need to demand. In our instance, the decrease in the input reductions leads to an increase in the supply cost for products, which pushes the supply curve to the left. And you can see that if the supply curve shifts to the left, prices increase. So now we're at P new, and quantity decreases. So now we're at Q new. And so this is basically what's happening in the model. Prices are going up and quantity is falling. Next slide. So finally, this report was published back in November. There has been some response by the EU media and researchers. We've been working with the economists in European Union who agree that these market impacts are expected. And the EU Ag Commissioner a couple of weeks ago said, yes, we could expect that production is going to fall if the farm to fork deal is implemented. But they have a number of counterpoints. One is that consumer diet preferences are changing. For that, we don't really have any information. Is not really our area of expertise. So that one we cannot address. But there are two more that talk about the productivity growth projections are too gloomy in our model. And that we agree. We actually don't have any change assumed for productivity in our work. So Marls will go over what you can expect for productivity. And the final point is that the trade restrictions are unlikely. For that, we say that there is a history of non-tariff barriers being put in place. But we do agree that the assumption on what countries join might be too strong. So perhaps not everyone in Africa might join. So the second part of Marles's presentation will look at what countries might be predicted to join. And finally, perhaps the key point in all of this is if market impacts are expected, if production is expected to decline, the key to the farm to fork and the Green Deal is basically the offsetting potential environmental impacts. There hasn't been any studies released on the market impacts or environmental impacts, but we would note that these environmental impacts are probably the key to living with the market impacts that we estimate here. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Jason. Perhaps now I could turn to Maros, who, as Jason said, is going to take what's been done so far and bring it further.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jason, for your presentation and for explaining what we did in our report, which was published, as you said, 6 months ago. Since that time, of course, we had time to consider some of those other issues for which there was not enough time for us to consider when we published this report. We published it in the record time of just a few months since we found out about these strategies and the ideas behind them. And we were able to put a lot of our assumptions together for this paper, but some were missing. And as Jason already talked about, the important one, which has been also brought up by our critics, is that we're not discussing enough of productivity gains in our work. As Jason just said, there's actually no assumption on any change in productivity as we were modeling these impacts of those strategies. And the other one was, what about the assumption of countries deciding to join these strategies? We only presented very polar scenarios, just the EU alone going ahead with those strategies or the entire world adopting them. And then we added that middle scenario that Jason described, which was just us deciding which countries might want to consider joining these strategies based on their export shares of their agriculture to the European Union. But again, this is just something that we put together with the help of our colleagues, but it was not endogenous in any sense. There's no decision that the model would lead us to for those countries to join or not. So in this work, the follow-up work that we have undertaken ever since we published this report, I will be discussing the two developments, the research areas that we paid attention to. The first one is knowing that the strategies are so likely, based on our model, to result in extra costs to agriculture, which means that we would see reductions in output and higher prices. We're considering one possibility to mitigate those impacts through productivity. So that would be one way to make those strategies easier to be adopted if we can have research and development investments, which would then create that growth which we need to offset the negative market impacts of those strategies. And the other one that we would like to consider is is there any way for countries which are outside of the European Union to make a decision to join these strategies based on trade policies that the European Union might put forward to make joining these strategies a condition for being able to trade with the European Union, or if the countries decide not to join those strategies, perhaps there would be non-trade barriers imposed by the European Union for those countries which stay outside, to impose additional costs to those countries. So what we are looking at is, can we ask our model to endogenously determine whether for some countries it might be beneficial to join the strategies because the access to the European market might be outweighing the cost of going ahead with those strategies and imposing all of those input reductions. Next slide, please. So as Jason already, this is an animated slide. If we can just, you may just go ahead with the animations. My apologies. I did not remove the animation. So So this is the economics of input restrictions that Jason already talked about. We have the supply and demand. We impose the strategies which result in severe reductions in inputs. We take a lot of land out, a lot of fertilizer, pesticides, and antimicrobials, which shifts the supply curve to the left, which, as Jason already discussed, leads to higher prices and higher quantities. How could productivity help here? Well, productivity has that ability to shift the supply to the right, to bring it potentially back to where we started by allowing more output to be generated with fewer inputs. So the idea here would be that maybe we can introduce productivity through innovation, which then of course needs to be well funded. We need to bring the investment into R&D, and then that R&D has to be adopted by farmers. But if we succeed at that, then we might be thinking, or we might be able to shift the supply back where it was, and then mitigate any negative market impacts of those strategies. Next slide, please. This is, of course, not a new idea. This is something that the European Commission had on its mind as soon as they were proposing these strategies, that there would need to be some innovation and accelerated knowledge transfer to the farmers to make, presumably, these strategies work. So we already know that the productivity growth is a requirement to mitigate these strategies, which without any additional action would just result in severely reduced output and higher prices. We know that the productivity, agricultural productivity, has historically been improving, which is great. However, the question is, in the time frame that the European Commission is thinking about, and they're thinking about 10 years for these strategies to be adopted, would we have enough time for the productivity growth to increase sufficiently to mitigate any negative market impacts of those strategies? Next slide, please. So to do that, we just looked at the historical trends in agricultural TFP. As you can see in this figure, we're showing in the orange line how the agricultural TFP increased between 1980 through 2016, which is the latest year for which we have data. As you can see, there was a significant increase in productivity globally, about 60%. The European Union had about the same increase in TFP, agricultural TFP. Some countries did better. For example, the United States, you can see the gray line, had about an 80% increase in TFP in agriculture. So we can see that agricultural TFP, in fact, increases over time, not constantly. There are some times when it increases less or more. However, the general trend is very positive. Now, what does this mean for farm-to-fork strategies? Is this growth in productivity sufficient to offset the negative impacts? So for that, next slide, please. We considered as another scenario using our CGE model, which was an augmented scenario where we allowed productivity to change endogenously in the model by fixing prices to remain constant. So what we did, we took advantage of a CGE framework, which allows variables which are normally exogenous productivity to become endogenous. And we are able to set variables which are normally considered endogenous, such as market prices, to be exogenous. So what we're able to do is to swap those variables and ask a very different question. And the question that we asked was, how much productivity, TFP increase, would we need so that we can still implement the farm-to-fork strategies and maintain stable agricultural prices? So we ran the model, and the model gave us answers. In the first column of this table, you can see the predicted or calculated TFP required changes for individual agricultural sectors, which would allow farm-to-fork strategies to be implemented without any changes on market prices for agricultural output. For example, for paddy rice, the model requires an 18% increase in productivity. And if that productivity increases by 18%, then the price impacts for paddy rice would be 0 in terms of prices, which means we'll be shifting the supply of rice to its original position. Now, the change of required productivity changes is not the same for all commodities. Some commodities need more of those inputs, which we're cutting under the farm-to-fork strategies. So for example, for wheat, we would need almost 37 increase in productivity. and for raw sugar, almost 50%. For others, such as fruits and nuts and vegetables, the required increase is only 9%. So we already know how much productivity we would need to see to make those strategies to be neutral from the market perspective. Now let's look back at those historical trends in agricultural TFP. So what we are doing here in the second column, we are looking back at the observed increase in productivity in Europe, and we look back, how many years did it take to reach such an increase as we need since 2016, prior to 2016. So for example, for paddy rice, we would need about 13 years of agricultural TFP growth to get us to this increase. For other commodities, such as fruits and vegetables, only 9 years. But for others, for example, raw sugar, it would be about 27 years of historical increase in agricultural TFP to give us the required increase in agricultural productivity to make the farm to fork strategies neutral from the perspective of market prices. As I already said, the idea is that, at least our read of the European Commission's strategies is that they would like to implement them in about 10-year time frame. So as you can see, for some commodities, this actually might work, which would be fruits and vegetables, where you only need 9 years to get that sufficient productivity increase. For others, for most of them, however, 10 years would not be sufficient. So for example, for raw sugar, you would need additional 17 years, which means that if the farm to fork strategies were implemented and the TFP growth would remain as we have seen historically up to year 2016, there would not be enough time for the TFP to mitigate sufficiently or completely any of those market impacts that Jason talked about. Next slide, please. So the second question that also we felt was very important for us to answer was the fact that the decision to adopt the strategies in our simulation was very exogenous. It was just to illustrate two extremes. First was just the European Union alone, as you can see in the map. Unfortunately, we have not yet had time to remove the UK from the European Union, so my apologies. This is still the European Union as it was last year. And then we considered every other country to join. And then we considered that middle scenario where we just decided, thank you, some countries based on their agricultural exports to the European Union might join, which includes Africa and countries in the European Free Trade Agreement. So that would be Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and some other partners in Europe. Of course, this is not something that was decided by the model. And what we wanted to do next was to see whether we can have the model tell us which countries might want to join the farm to fork strategies if the European Union is able to implement some non-tariff measures to make joining the strategies beneficial by allowing trade to continue with the European Union. So a country which decides to join would be able to export agricultural output to the European Union as before. However, countries which would decide to stay outside of this farm to fork strategies, they would face non-tariff measures which would restrict imports to the European Union and those countries which join by 50%. Now, this is not a very easy thing to do in a standard CGE model because the decision for a country to join or not join, which would be determined by the welfare in being in one of those states. So we would consider the welfare of a country which decides to join the farm to fork. And then we compare it to the welfare if it stays outside, but then faces restrictions to access to the European agricultural market. And we can see which one of those is higher so that the country can decide which way it would go. However, if each country makes a choice, that choice can affect other countries' decisions as well. So the first country which gets the choice to join the European Union in farm to fork would get a very exclusive access to the European market. Now, if other countries start joining and more countries join that block, the trading block, then the benefits perhaps for the first country to join may no longer outweigh the losses from adopting the farm to fork strategy. So as you can think, as you can see, this is a very dynamic situation. And we needed to run our model many times to find the Nash equilibrium of the countries where no country would like to make any more changes. So what we allowed the model to do in 6 iterations, to go through each country, ask the country, would you like to join or not, evaluate the welfare, whether it would be leaving the block or joining the block. And then when we discovered that there's no more countries wishing to make any more changes, then we had our set of countries for which we would be able to say that, well, these countries might benefit from joining the bloc if the cost of not joining is facing the NTMs by the European Union. An important note is that we're looking at the equation EV after adopting the farm to fork or after facing the non-tariff measures by the European Union. These numbers are generally negative. It's not that there's any expectation that by allowing countries to make their own decisions, we're making this entire concept, the strategies to be welfare increasing. It's really deciding between a lesser loss in welfare rather than finding some decision, making a decision which leads to a greater welfare overall. An interesting conclusion from our endogenous determination of membership is that some of the countries which we thought would actually want to join based on how integrated they are with the European agricultural market, such as Egypt, Morocco, and Switzerland, they actually would not be joining based on this model's results, because they would be actually benefiting more by just facing the non-tariff measures and not undergoing the input reductions. Next slide, please. So here you can see the final map of the countries which are members of the set of the Nash equilibrium countries which would want to stay within the bloc and adopting the farm to fork strategies. These are marked in orange. In addition to those orange countries, I also wanted to highlight the fact that I was talking about, that some countries might want to join, but only if they have the exclusive access. And as the bloc grows, that benefit from that exclusive access disappears. These countries are marked in yellow. So these are the countries which in our simulation would consider joining the European Union in the first iteration, when it was just themselves, and just that country alone would have that exclusive access to the European Union market. But later on, they would drop off. And they include, for example, Canada. So Canada, if it was just Canada and the EU, and if Canada would get that preferential access to the European Union market, it would be in the interest of Canada to adopt the farm to fork strategies. However, as other countries start joining that benefit from that exclusive access to the EU's agricultural market, just does not outweigh the cost of farm to fork anymore. And of course, the countries which are in white are the countries which would not benefit from joining these strategies at any point. Next, thank you. So finally, to conclude the results that we are getting out of our simulation and to compare them to the middle scenario that Jason talked about, this table gives you just the highlights of the market impacts, and you can see that the impacts are actually much smaller in those negative terms than the middle scenario. So in the middle scenario that Jason described earlier, we just decided that the countries which are trading most heavily on exporting to the European Union would join farm to fork, and then we have the endogenously determined set of countries that I just described. As you can see that the endogenous group is a bit smaller. So rather than representing about 30% of the global agricultural production, our group, which is endogenously determined, would be about 20%. So it's about 2/3 of the original set, and they represent about half of the population. As you can see in the bottom part of the table, even though we have reduced the size of those countries in terms of agricultural production by 1/3, generally the market impacts are much smaller, because remember, here the countries are making the decision to join when the welfare impact is the smallest. So rather than forcing countries in the middle scenario to join regardless of what the welfare impact is, here we're just allowing the model just to find those countries where the welfare impact would be the smallest. So as you can see, the impact on production is much smaller. It's only 2% reduction of agricultural production globally. Prices, global prices, only increased by 8% rather than 21% in the middle scenario. There is a reduction in trade of 7%. Farm income increases by the same 4%. Important change here for food cost. Rather than seeing an overall global increase in per capita food cost by $159, the exogenous scenario reduces that to $46. And also GDP, the overall welfare of the world falls by a much smaller number in the endogenous scenario by about $182 billion. Next slide, please. So just to sum up these two pathways that we considered for farm to fork strategies to be perhaps viable. Of course, this is just the model deciding what is viable. We're not making any decision what countries should do. It's just if the countries were to follow what the model is predicting, what would be the natural consequences for the countries and their decision to adopt the strategies. So if we consider these model results, then we need to say that unless we could speed up significantly agricultural productivity growth in the European Union, it's very unlikely that these growths in productivity could offset the negative market impacts of the farm to fork strategies in the 10-year time frame that the European Commission is thinking about. Another important conclusion is that if the European Union could impose these trade restrictions, they could make these farm to fork strategies globally viable by restricting access to their market through these non-tariff barriers. They could create the additional trade-off for countries, which could be greater. The benefit from maintaining the trade relationship with the European Union might be greater than the farm to fork impacts. And as a result, some of the countries might be willing to be part of that project. That's all for me. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Maros. So we've heard from two agricultural economists and who have discussed their theoretical models. Now we're going to turn to Aaron Fowler, who is the Chief Agricultural Negotiator for the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And I think we'll approach this discussion from more of a practitioner's point of view rather than from a theoretical economics model. Aaron.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thanks, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I think this is an innovative event discussing a very topical issue, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to take part. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'll just talk to you. I know some of you would probably prefer to look at a screen than me, but this is how we're going to go forward. I have to say, it is a little bit difficult to follow Jason and Maros. My fellow panelists have brought you a very detailed analysis that's backed up by data that they have spent months manipulating, and I do not have anything like that. I am principally a trade negotiator, and I deal in what I like to call the art of the possible. So while stats and analysis certainly inform the work that we do, frequently it feels like it's a little less important than the ability to effectively communicate outcomes and implications. And I think in that respect, there's a nice parallel with today's topic. So my role, I think, at least to me, is quite interesting. I do cover trade policy and negotiations, so work on agricultural issues that are implicated in Canada's free trade agreements, as well as at the World Trade Organization. But the folks who work for me also have responsibility for food and agriculture issues in international organizations, whether that's the FAO or the G20 or APEC or elsewhere, as well as technical trade policy in the agri-food space, including issues related related to international standardization. And I think that range of topics allows me to see intersections between a whole host of policy areas, from trade to food security to environmental sustainability, and the way that both international standards and different approaches to domestic regulation can impact outcomes in those areas. I thought it might be interesting, I don't know, to start with a short story. So it feels like a lifetime ago, but in fact, it was just prior to the onset of the pandemic in December of 2019. I took a trip first to meetings at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and then straight from there to meetings at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. It was interesting because we were talking about similar topics in both areas, but very differently. So in Geneva, some of you may be aware that food security is a topic that is getting a lot of attention these days, and it has in recent years. But very much from the standpoint of public stockholding and flexibility from existing disciplines for agricultural domestic support that might be appropriate to allow countries to establish or to maintain support programs for food security purposes. So we wanted to talk about food security in that context, but we also wanted to talk about the potential food security impacts of policies being implemented or announced by certain members, including the European Union, related to the use of agricultural innovations, plant protection products, etc., and how this would influence global food security. Our feeling was that because, in this case, the European Union is such an important market for agri-food products, it's the world's largest importer of agri-food goods, trade restrictions into the European Union around the use of those technologies would create a disincentive to their use, not just in the European Union, but globally. So some of the themes that were touched on in the earlier presentations, and that this would have knock-on effects for global food production and food security. So we met with a number of countries, including net food importing developing countries. And I have to say the reaction in Geneva was, this is very interesting. We appreciate you bringing it to our attention, but it's not trade policy. It relates to agricultural production systems, and it's something that would be better discussed with our colleagues at the FAO in Rome. So we said, okay, that's point well taken. We're on our way to Rome. We'll talk to them. So when we got to Rome, the focus in the FAO was on food security, but from the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. Everybody will be aware that Sustainable Development Goal 2 is to end hunger. And so they were looking at food security from a production or a food system standpoint. And so we wanted to flag again the potential impacts that we thought we were seeing of country-specific policies on the adoption and use of agricultural innovations, and therefore on agricultural production at the FAO. And when we met with countries there, including food exporting countries and net food importing countries, the reaction was quite interesting. It was, well, that's fascinating. We appreciate you bringing this to our attention, but a lot of these outcomes seem to be things that would be manifest through trade policy. So it sounds like the sort of conversation you should be having with our colleagues in Geneva, not here in Rome. So I came away from that trip with a very strong impression that this suite of interconnections was a bit of a waterbed of issues. So if you push down in one area, you're going to get a bulge that pops up somewhere else that you might not have been expecting. And I felt that it was at least possible that important issues were falling between the cracks, because it wasn't evident who was looking at the full range of these issues in a coherent and horizontal manner. I think personally, I hope that the upcoming Food Systems Summit will help to unpack some of these complexities, or will at least accurately help to accurately frame these complexities for further discussion. But it was something that was quite striking to me at the time. And so since then, I very much tried to take the lens of these interconnections to my own engagement on these issues and that of my team. And I think we're increasingly, both within Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and across the government of Canada, taking a more horizontal perspective on many of these issues. Before I go any farther, I thought it would be useful just to state briefly for the record what Canada's position is on climate change. So I suspect everybody is aware, but we are a signatory to the Paris Agreement, and we have set out ambitious domestic environmental targets related to that agreement. These targets include exceeding our climate goal of reducing greenhouse gases by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, and legislating Canada's goal of net zero emissions by 2050. But of course, we have to achieve those goals in a manner that does not inhibit our ability to realize other important objectives. For example, those related to food security or the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals globally, including SDG 2. So how does Canadian agriculture fit into the government's reaction to the climate crisis? Well, agricultural land, of course, is both a source and a solution for greenhouse gas emissions. Canadian agriculture has an important role to play in Canada meeting its climate goals. The Canadian agriculture sector is particularly vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change, whether that's through the degradation of soil, loss of biodiversity, and production losses that are caused by extreme weather. And just as an aside on that last point, I've seen studies suggesting that the number and cost of catastrophic weather events in the past decade alone in Canada, whether you're talking about flooding in the prairies and in Ontario and Quebec, or wildfires in Alberta and BC in the north, or severe weather events that damage Canadian crops, they occurred at a rate that was twice as high in the past decade as was the case over the course of the previous 5 decades. And insured losses alone related to extreme weather events totaled over $18 billion between 2010 and 2019. So clearly the sector, I think, has skin in the game, and they recognize that they have skin in the game. There's no surprise there. But the sector has an important opportunity to make a significant contribution to combating climate change and to Canada's efforts to combat and respond to climate change. So, as I said, I'm a trade person. I'm not an environmental or a climate change specialist, but I would nevertheless like to take a moment just to talk about the policy approach that the Canadian government has taken to address climate change in the agriculture sector, and that is to invest in supporting the development and the adaptation of new agriculture and agri-food innovations and projects that mitigate the impacts of climate change, improve climate resiliency, and promote environmentally beneficial practices. Some examples, on March 31st of this year, the Canadian government announced the creation and launch of the Natural Climate Solutions Fund. This is a $4 billion 10-year fund that is designed to help address climate change and biodiversity loss. And as part of that initiative, the Canadian government announced on April 1st a 10-year, $185 million agricultural climate solutions fund, which will focus on the development and implementation of farming practices to tackle climate change. And the Agricultural Climate Solutions Fund aims to establish a strong Canada-wide network of regional collaborations that are led by farmers and include scientists and other sectoral stakeholders. The fund seeks to address climate change mitigation measures, and climate change resiliency through projects that focus on sequestering carbon and reducing greenhouse gases, conserving soil that is healthier and more resilient, developing ways to conserve clean water, protecting biodiversity for sustainable farming, and reducing the effects of climate change more broadly. The Canadian government has also supported the adoption of clean technologies in agriculture to help meet Canadian climate change objectives. The Agricultural Clean Technology Program is a $25 million 3-year investment spanning, it runs, I guess, until the end of this year presently, which aims to support research, development, and the adoption of clean technologies through investments in and the promotion of precision agriculture and agri-based bioproducts as part of a broader climate action plan. So as you can see, the government is very active. The Canadian government is very active in this space and is working in close partnership with the agri-food sector, with provincial and territorial governments in Canada, with First Nations, and with others. Ultimately, Canada believes that helping the world's farmers to produce more food on less land, to reduce food waste, to reduce greenhouse gases, and to respond to climate change and reduce the environmental footprint requires both promoting and commercializing agricultural innovations that allow farmers and food processors to be adaptable and to seek new approaches to the production of food. Innovation is an important contributor to food security. New crops and new approaches to production help the world's farmers produce more food on less land, reduce their food waste, and deliver other environmental benefits. For example, products of biotechnology can improve crop quality, reduce food waste, and contribute to food security by offering varieties that are higher yielding, more resistant to devastating disease, or that are resistant to bruising and browning, and therefore yield less loss and waste. Modern agricultural practices such as precision agriculture can minimize agro impacts on soil, water, air, biodiversity. And automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence offer exciting opportunities to improve farming techniques and tackle challenges, including those associated with labor shortages in the sector. And finally, vertical farming and products of biotech could help to produce more food on less land with fewer inputs. To illustrate the impact of these technologies and advancements, I would just note that the average farm in Canada was producing twice as much in 2011 using the same inputs as was the case 50 years previously. Pardon me. Great. Everybody says that's great. We knew a lot of that, and we thought you were a trade guy. So how exactly does trade fit in, and why are you spending all your time talking about the Government of Canada's climate policy? Well, I'm happy to turn to trade. So for starters, global food security requires the movement of food from areas of surplus to areas of scarcity. It's kind of banal and obvious, but I think it's worth saying. These global supply chains rest on a predictable trading system that enables the movement of agriculture and food products. And the innovations that I spoke about are only going to be adopted, and the benefits of their use are only going to be realized if regulatory frameworks around the world are science and risk-based, enable innovation, and facilitate trade so that farmers can have confidence in their ability to market their products. No farmer is going to grow surplus crops if she does not believe she will be able to get those crops to market. So it is not too much to say, in my opinion, that the attainment of Sustainable Development Goal 2 requires a predictable, enforceable, global trading environment that is based on rules, scientific evidence, and risk analysis. A transparent and predictable, rules-based international trading system ensures that we can equip farmers around the world with the tools that they need to mitigate the negative effects of climate change and increase their productivity and the sustainability of global food systems. The introduction and commercialization of agricultural innovations can make a tremendous contribution to both food security and sustainability, but only if those innovations and their adoption is not hampered by needless regulatory restrictions. In instances where countries are developing sustainability standards to address, pardon me, to address domestic climate change objectives, care must be taken so that the associated regulations are not more restrictive than necessary, do not unnecessarily distort trade, and are based on relevant international standards, science, and evidence. In conclusion, as you can see, this is an area of complex interrelationships, something I'm sure you were well aware of, with many threads running between issues. It is only to be expected that countries will take different policy approaches to adapting and mitigating the impact of climate change in their territories. However, care must be taken to ensure that one country's approach to combating climate change does not undermine other countries' efforts or contribute to worsening outcomes in other areas, such as food security. I appreciate very much the opportunity to come and speak with you today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And I encourage everyone who has joined us today to submit questions in the Q&A function, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator and ask a question of all three of our panelists. In the paper, Jason and Maros, you've given us three scenarios: EU only, EU plus, and global. And you've addressed, Maros, particularly in your presentation, what countries might find it in their interest to join the EU farm to fork proposal, but you haven't really addressed the global scenario where countries would just sign on to the EU proposal. So I put the question out there to the two of you, Jason and Maros, as to how likely that is. And then I'd also appreciate Aaron's perspective as a trade negotiator. So perhaps our USDA colleagues might want to start off.
Jason, shall I go first? So that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Of course, the global scenario, we thought that it would be highly artificial. The idea that every single country would sign up to this, I don't think it's terribly likely. I do not know how many international agreements there are that every country would participate in. So the probability of joining based on the evidence, based on our model, that would require some additional assumptions. As I talked about the countries that might want to join the EU, we considered the EU's own trade policy, and it's an assumption. We do not know whether this actually can happen or would happen or will happen, which would then make it beneficial for some countries to join. We would have to make an assumption, are there other countries that could sort of act as those centers of trade hubs, which are so important, and they would want to actually go ahead with this and attract more countries. We did not want to even make such an assumption. We never really considered what other countries might do that. Of course, if it was in those countries' interests to do that, and there could be some benefit from, let's say, climate and environmental protection that we absolutely ignored in our work. So we actually are unable to say that a country, this particular country in the world, might actually want to go ahead with this because there will be benefits to climate or their environment. We are unable to speak about that at all. So I think we're staying in a highly speculative position here. We are only focusing on the EU. We're making the speculations about what they might be able to do. We don't know really if they will do it. And we do not really want to go any much further. But Jason can speak about his views too.
Yeah, so my thought, we basically wanted just to show the extreme case. And like Marl said, it's highly unlikely, but basically wanted to show a range of what could happen based on, and it's not just related to the Green Deal, but it's very based more on countries reducing inputs in general. Versus say maybe taking the approach of increasing yields. So there's a little bit of a trade-off between what countries do with innovation. Do they save on inputs, or do they use it to produce more outputs? And so that was sort of what we were trying to get at. And I think the results that Maros presented, obviously, they showed that not everyone in the world would adopt the strategy. So I think the global scenario was very extreme, and I think the model results from that middle scenario that Maros presented validate that not everyone would join.
Thank you, Aaron. Perhaps you might speak a bit to how you see this from a trade policy perspective, and perhaps also give us some insights into what is actually going on in the WTO or elsewhere with regard to agricultural trade negotiations, or the possibility of such negotiations allied to countries' climate change policies.
Thanks, Elaine. You just added that second part on there like it was easy, and I just pick it up at the end. I'll do my best. I would, from a trade policy perspective, my instincts are telling me that the outcome isn't going to be much different than what Jason and Maros have identified in their paper, right? I think most countries are going to look at this suite of EU policies and ask themselves a few questions. One is, to what extent do these policies align with the environmental policies that we are considering for our own purposes anyway? And so is there an opportunity here to perhaps kill two birds with one stone? They will also say, what are the implications of this purely from a commercial agri-food perspective, right? So how important are exports to my agri-food sector as opposed to my domestic market? For those exports, how big is the European Union as an export destination? Is it significant or is it kind of marginal? And I think that those answers will inform the extent to which countries will be tempted to sign on or to go along with these policies. I suspect that probably what will happen is that you won't see so many countries that are aligning their own domestic regimes with the European Union, but you may see parts of countries' agri-food sectors that are voluntarily aligning their own production processes with what the European Union is requiring, right? Because they have determined that even though this might not be a priority from my national government's perspective or from our agriculture sector's perspective broadly, it's really important for one particular commodity that we export a lot to the European Union. And so, we're going to align ourselves with those policies in any event. I think it remains to be seen. I do think, we're all moving in the same direction, but we're taking different paths to get there. And I think the closer that endpoint gets for all of us, the less difficult it's going to be to make decisions around aligning with other countries, because there will be to an extent an alignment of outcomes that's happening anyway. But for now, I think that there will not be a broad avalanche of countries that are going along with the European Union approach in the short term. On the question of ag negotiations, look, I'll try to answer it quickly. I'll just say we've been negotiating under the Doha Development Agenda, well, since before it was called the Doha Development Agenda. The ag negotiations were built into the last round, and so we've been negotiating since 2000. That's 21 years. We have not, we've harvested some minor or low-hanging fruit along the way, but the big issues of market access and domestic support continue to I think bedevil negotiators in Geneva. It's not clear to me that blockage is going to be moving anytime in the short term. We've added new and challenging issues to this, including the ones that we're talking about today, but also food security, public stockholding, food security type issues that are hard to resolve. So I think adding issues to the agriculture agenda, whether that is climate change oriented, is probably not going to help move the ag agenda forward, and it's probably not going to help to move those issues forward. So I suspect that to the extent there's a desire to have a discussion or a negotiation in Geneva on border adjustment taxes or some other aspect of country's climate change regime, it will not be done in the ag context. It will be done as a separate negotiating group. That's my guess. Sorry to go on so long.
No, not at all. Now, I know there have been a number of questions in the chat, which Jason has answered already. I see there's one for Aaron, which says, how will Canada respond to the EU Green Deal? Has Canada been approached to consider being a signatory?
Well, Canada and the European Union have regular ongoing dialogue in all kinds of fora around the world on these issues, right? At the WTO and in other international organizations. And we also have bilateral discussions, including in the context of various committees and working groups that have been established under the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. And so these are conversations that are going on between European and Canadian officials all the time. And I think in some cases, there are aspects of EU policies that are not understood by Canada. There are implications that are not understood by Canada. And there are aspects that at first blush are, concerning to us. And similarly, there are aspects of Canada's environmental and agricultural policies that give rise to questions in the European Union. And as countries do, we try to work through these. I don't think I think Canada and the European Union like to think of each other as like-minded on the question of climate, right? We share an ambitious orientation to do something to address the climate crisis. Whether we think that the specific measures the European Union has taken would be the right measures for us, I'm not sure, but I think we believe that there's an opportunity to collaborate in this space and I think that you will see us increasingly doing so. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be following EU policies in every direction, but I think there's an opportunity to work together.
Thank you. I think the next question is largely for our research paper authors. What are the primary strategies being developed by the EU to increase production outside of inputs? Perhaps Jason or Maros would like to speak to that.
So a big part of the farm to fork strategies and deforestation strategies revolve around soil health. And I can't remember if it's in a strategy or if it's in the broader Green Deal, but they mentioned they want to improve soil health by 75%. And this is actually sort of, it's a circle where they say, if you use less inputs, it's going to improve soil health, which is going to reduce erosion, which will increase production. So there's sort of like a circular aspect. And I think apart from that, there, like I said, some of the mention was we are not considering productivity, and they say that productivity could increase, but there hasn't been a mention of or improving yield varieties or anything like that. So basically, what we've seen is just produce more products from lesser land and using lesser inputs.
If I can add, maybe, I do not know that much about how the European Union wants to address the question of agricultural productivity, but I have spoken, we have given this presentation to different farmers groups in the European Union, and just some interesting points that were raised were that precision agriculture is something that is on the minds of a lot of people. I spoke to somebody in the Czech Republic, or actually that gentleman spoke to the group about their interest in doing that and improving their precision agriculture. And there's also an interesting discussion about the heterogeneity of input use in the European Union. It almost felt like a little bit of pointing fingers that not all countries within the EU are equal. And there are countries, especially in the eastern part of the European Union, which appear that they have already reduced a lot of their inputs already. And it seems like that these farmers are asking if they need to also be doing the same reductions as opposed to farmers in the West, which use significantly more pesticides and fertilizer. So I don't really have an answer. I just think that there might be some discussion within the EU. That's my expectation based on what I've heard from the farmers about the distributional impacts and making it work so that the countries which are already the heaviest users might cut more. But this is just my speculation based on what I have heard.
Okay, thank you. For the panel, I've asked Tyler McCann, who's the Chief Engagement Officer at CAPI, to help me with the questions, given my limited setup here, lying on my couch. So Tyler, perhaps you could let us know what the next question is.
So Elaine, I think some of these questions have been answered already in the chat box, but we may go back to a couple of them that build on some recent points. There are a couple around innovation. So for example, one question is, isn't the pace of innovation accelerating? Another one was what research innovation impacts can get through regulatory and have adoption of any significance in the next 10 years? And so I wonder if our colleagues from USDA can answer from their perspective, and then Aaron could speak to trade enabling solutions that might support that acceleration and innovation.
Yeah, so the innovation question, I think probably if you look at, and Marl's had the productivity for the world, and he showed, it is increasing. Is it accelerating? That is probably a fair statement, but I think a lot of the increase is not being done on the developed country side, but rather developing countries who are, lagging behind the innovation that's being done in the US, Canada, and EU, who are adopting these techniques. We will note that the US technological progress is also increasing, and perhaps some of that is speaking to Marlos's point about precision agriculture, which has been adopted much more since 2000. And then the one about regulatory and time, that's actually a very good point. So there is the idea of this treadmill effect where countries have to consistently have an increase in R&D just to basically keep their head above water with technological progress. And then if you're mentioning any sort of big technological change, it's likely going to take a lot of regulatory hurdles to overcome, and whether or not they can be done in 10 years and whether or not farmers would implement those strategies. So precision agriculture was around for some time, and adoption took 20 years in the US just to meet 95% target.
Thank you. Anyone have anything further to add, or perhaps Tyler, you could go to the next question.
Sure. So there are a couple of questions that relate to the potential benefits of the EU Green Deal. For example, there's a question here, some portion of the EU policy targets the reduction of negative externalities, pollution due to overuse of fertilizer, overuse of antibiotics, etc. So the question was whether or not the study that ERS did attempted to measure those benefits. And in the similar vein, the question was, how does the model account for climate impacts like drought or flood? And is there an assumption around stability in climate change?
Yes, so basically for the last point, we did not consider any changes in climate, but that's a very good point. To look at sort of what these crop simulation models are predicting for the next 10 years and see how the farm to fork strategies would play out with those. And I forget the first question.
Is there any benefits in the model?
Oh, yes. No. Yeah. So obviously, I mean, that was, you know, a big point of our study, a big point of the presentation is the EU is doing this for a reason, and it's probably not to, you know, have losses in the agricultural sector. But unfortunately, you know, they have not had a study on the market or environmental impacts, which could provide some of this information. And we have not been able to quantify the environmental impacts.
Thank you. Tyler?
And so on another question about productivity gains, the question has just come in terms of climate stress, are there productivity gains more broadly from improving our crop per drop by replicating innovations in Israel, Australia, Denmark, and the Netherlands? Is this something that ERS has looked at?
The potential impacts from a changing climate are a goal of the Biden administration, and it's something that is on our radar, but we haven't actually conducted that research. But it's all good points, and something that we will need to think about in the coming years.
Next, go ahead.
So shifting gears to the trade policy discussion, so a question for Aaron. Is there a possibility that the WTO Trade and Environment Committee will become more active in addressing environmental and trade issues? The comment goes on, up to now, it seems that case law and dispute settlement has been more influential in this area. Is that likely to continue to be the case?
I don't know how much case law is going to be influencing rules of the WTO in the short term, given the current impasse with the appellate body at the WTO. So I think the era of case law being developed at all is probably at least on pause for the time being, and we'll see how we resolve the current situation before we can say with any confidence the extent to which we should expect any innovative interpretations coming out of cases in the future. The CTE, I think this CTE is a body that has evolved since its creation, and both, I think, in response to the evolution of the WTO as an institution over the course of the last 25 years or so, but also in response to the evolution of the issues, environmental issues, and how they impact and rub up against the trade policy considerations that the WTO deals with. It's not, however, really a rulemaking body, right? Like most of the committees at the WTO, it's there to discuss existing rules and obligations and how these have been interpreted by the members and how they've been incorporated those interpretations into their domestic trade regimes, and looking at international environmental obligations and how they kind of rest with international trade obligations. But it's not a group that's oriented to move the yardsticks in terms of the rules that are on the books today. So I think if WTO members want to deepen the rules around trade and environment, they can certainly do so. But I'm not sure that that would be the body that they would use for those discussions. I suspect that probably in the short term, it's a topic that lends itself to progress through a plurilateral initiative rather than a negotiation that involves the full membership of the WTO. That whole frame of negotiation is also something that's been up for a lot of discussion in Geneva over the course of the last several months. But all to say, I think the CTE is useful and has become better asset for the WTO membership in recent years, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the world in the short term.
Okay, I think I've been told that we have 1 minute. So does that give us time to have one final question?
I think so. We can ask probably a point of clarification, Elaine. There was, I think, a reference to a comment made earlier by USDA officials. 95% adoption of precision ag in the US. The question is, what stats were being drawn upon for that point, given that there's still an infrastructure investment in broadband and applications across the whole sector for 95% to be realized?
So as official, I will go with the researcher because I'm just a humble economist. But you can look at the ARM survey that ERS does to look at different types of precision agriculture that's been adopted. And I think the numbers, I don't know if it's 95%, but the numbers are pretty high, at least for corn. And obviously the numbers differ based on differing technology, nitrogen, soil inhibitor, using GPS, for example, is considered precision technology. So I think you could look at, I think our numbers are published online for different crops.
Okay, well, as I understand it, that's all the time that we have. I believe that Martha may come on to encourage us all to stay online and enjoy the networking session, and then to take part in the third and final session this afternoon. I just want to express my thanks to the panelists, Jason, Maros, and Aaron, and to Tyler for helping with questions. It's been extremely interesting for someone like me who doesn't have much of an economic background to read your paper, Jason and Maros, and then to hear from Aaron about how he sees things playing out in the world of trade negotiations. So let me once again thank everyone for attending this afternoon's session. And I very much hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the proceedings. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our facilitator.
Thank you, Elaine. And thank you everyone for that great discussion. At this time, we have another short break. The next session is Asia Pacific Perspectives, and that will start promptly at 2:45 p.m. Central Time. Make sure you return to the Event Hub and join that session using the blue View Session button. And you can also utilize that networking lounge that Elaine mentioned during the break as well. But I hope to see you back for the Asia Pacific Perspective session at 2:45 Central. Thanks very much.